Hi, everyone. I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy librarian at the Maine State Library. And tonight I'm going to do an overview of doing genealogy research in Maine. So let's get started and talk about Maine. First of all, Maine was part of first the Massachusetts Bay Colony and then the state of Massachusetts until 1820. Today, Maine's population is the oldest, whitest, and most rural of all 50 US states. It's also the most forested state by a good bit. Um, the earliest settlement here was the same year as Jamestown, and it was the Popham colony. It lasted 14 months. It was people from the moderate climate of England who tried to overwinter in Maine and weren't really prepared for the difference in climate. The first real permanent settlement was what's now the town of York in 1630, although some other towns dispute that, but we'll go with that. Maine's population grew slowly for quite a while because it is not the easiest place to make a living. And by the 1840s and 50s, you start getting people claiming free land, moving out to the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and then the Great Plains states, Kansas, Nebraska, and so on, where the winter was about the same. The summers were a little warmer and a little bit longer. And for farming, the land was flat and the soil was not full of rocks. So it was a really, in many ways, better place to be a farmer. Around the same time, from about 1840 to 1930, you get an influx of Canadians coming to Maine, primarily people from Quebec. And that tended to stop with the Great Depression in 1930. Maine now has 16 counties. Originally, it was all York County, and then various counties were set off through 1860, when there have been a few little county boundary changes since then, but the 16 counties have been here since then. So let me talk briefly. This is a very early map. Maine is the area here where it says Sagadahoc. That's actually now known as one of the counties is Sagadahoc. You have Massachusetts down here, New Hampshire, Acadia that becomes Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and then Quebec up here. Early settlement in Maine tended to be along the coast and then along the rivers. You notice there's not a lot of detail here. The Maine coast is very uneven and rocky. So early on, you get not very detailed maps, actually. And as I said, Maine was part of Massachusetts Bay. And you get the whole structure of New England in the 1600s is different than what it is now. Connecticut was actually two colonies, the Connecticut colony and the New Haven colony. And what we think of Massachusetts
I was
were actually Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth. New Hampshire was also part of Massachusetts Bay at times. And then, as I said, you had Maine. And then this map on the right shows how you get settlement going up the coast and then inland. And then you have areas up here where there are no coloration from this scale. And that means those are essentially empty. There's actually a map floating around the internet that's very interesting. And basically, it's just the roads. It's no other landmarks. And it essentially looks like the colored squares of this because there's just not much up here. It's all forested. And then you also, this is on the right is Nova Scotia, and on the left of this is New Brunswick. And the topography, you have the coast that's rocky, but pretty much at sea level. And then you get a little strip in here that's fairly fertile farmland. And then you get the what's essentially the northern end of the Appalachian Mountains. Here's Katahdin. And there, I went to a historical society. I grew up over here in Western Maine. And I went to a historical society meeting several years ago where a man who had done some research in early surveying in Maine was speaking. And he told a story of some surveyors right after Maine became a state in 1820. They were working their way away from the coast to survey so that the land could be sold. They get over here, the edge of the mountains, run into a couple right next to near each other. They're not really full mountains. They're much closer to hills, but they pretty much have a sheer rock face. And so this surveyor in about 1823 wrote in his journal, nobody's going to want this land. He turned around and went back to Portland. Just like, nobody's going to want this land. It's now where there are ski resorts and things like that. But for farming, it was useless. So let's start with one of the backbones of genealogy research, which is vital records. Maine did not require towns to record vital records and send them to the state until 1892. Many towns kept records of varying degrees of completeness and reliability before 1892, but a lot of places didn't. Up through about the 1830s, a lot of Maine really was still the frontier. It was the northern frontier, the way Ohio and Illinois were the western frontier. And so it can be hard to find vital records before 1892. I have people come in wanting, because they're stuck on their Mayflower or DAR line. They come into the library looking for help, and sorry, but unfortunately, if you're just looking for vital records and not willing to look in other ways, with some of the other things I'm going to talk about, Maine can be where lineage society applications come to die. One of the other things I encourage people to do is, with your 19th century Maine ancestors, keep track of siblings in particular, because of two things. One is, because of that exodus to the Midwest, you may find that the letters your ancestor here in Maine wrote to somebody else that have announcements of births, marriages, and deaths may be in a family papers collection out in Nebraska or Illinois. And the other thing is, through this period, both Quebec and Massachusetts have much better records. Quebec with the French Catholic Church keeping very good records. Massachusetts starting civil registration as a requirement in 1841. So you essentially in Massachusetts get 2 generations of people covered by vital records that you don't get here in Maine. And I have more than once helped somebody solve something where we can prove that person A and person B are siblings, and person B settles in Massachusetts and has a death record in the 1870s, whereas the sibling here in Maine who dies within a year or two has no death record, so there's no listing of parents' names. One of the things to know is that the Maine Genealogical Society, on their website, under the research menu, has a document that you can download that tells you what vital records are accessible online or if they've been published. So if you click on this link, you get a document that looks like this. It's arranged by county and then by town name. And this column here is if something's been published. So, Farming Historical Society has done this. Walthams are at digitalmaine.com. Sydney's were published by Picton Press. And if it's published, this is the year they were published. And then this column, when it says online, unless it says otherwise, it's online at Family Search. Now, there are some records that haven't been either digitized or published. In most cases, the state library has those on microfilm. Well, technically, we have the state archives big filing cabinet of their these microfilms, because the state archives is currently only open by appointment. So the archivist and I decided it was better to have them at the library with regular opening hours. Only up to 1922 is available online in most cases. It had been 1955, and there was a reinterpretation of that. We at the library do have microfilm that you can use that's up to 1955. After that, you have to go to Vital Records and show that you have a reason to get it. I can do lookups. I can't look up 73 people for you, but I can do quick lookups, and so that's helpful. I hope for you. So if you're stuck on something, feel free to send me an email, and I'll see what I can find. Now, the records are on these cards. These were originally cards, and they are organized on the microfilm by year. By surname, and then by year, and then all the births in that year, all the marriages and deaths. And I pulled these three for various reasons because I wanted to show you some of this. So, for example, you'll notice this first one, the child's name is just the last name. There's no first name. So that's one of the things when you're looking online, if you're not finding somebody, you may want to take out the first name and see if anything comes up. This one was originally recorded as unnamed Cook, and at some point they went back and added Charles Wesley. So that also happened. You get the birth date, if they were twins or triplets, first, second, third baby. You get the parents' information, which isn't always as complete as you'd like. And then, the date of who recorded it. If you're looking at older records before 1892, some of them are in books and some had been copied onto cards like this. So if you get one that's on a card, you may want to look and see if the book still exists at the town level. Because here in Maine, vital records like this are recorded at the town level, not the county. And so if you're not finding it at the state level, or it's not legible at the state level, sometimes it's worth going to the town. Here's a marriage record. These are the back and the front of the card. Births and deaths are only the front of the card. And again, you get information about the two people getting married. In this case, you have John Gallagher and Harriet Fleming. He lives in Woodstock. He's an attorney. I'm a little surprised Woodstock was big enough at this time to have somebody working as a lawyer, because I think the current population of Woodstock is something like 237 people. Born in New Brunswick. He's never been married before. She's a widow. You get the information about the marriage, and then on the back, you get the parents' information. Harriet Fleming is a widow, so you'll notice her father's name is John Kirk. What's interesting, I look at this and he was born in Scotland. Kids born in daughters born in Nova Scotia ends up in the U.S. It's the same. My grandparents did the Scotland, Toronto, U.S. rather than Nova Scotia, but this was not at all an uncommon thing to have happen, of some people from Ireland and Scotland going first to Canada, then coming to the US. Here's another one. Again, you get various bits of information. Sometimes you get lucky and they give you the exact place in where somebody was born. More often if it's here in the US. Often if it's Canada or another country, it just says the country name. So that's sort of the range of what you'll see on marriage records. Divorce. It happened. As much as we like to think that dysfunctional families are a modern invention, that you also did get divorces. The indexes for these that are not indexed within a year or county, but you have a county book, or you have a book that has the divorces by county within a year. A website has very nicely been indexing those. So if you aren't sure of the year or the county, and so here's one where I looked it up, and we have this Dunlop in 1900. Then you go to the Digital Maine repository, which is digitalmaine.com. You search for divorce returns. You find the correct year. And then what you get is alphabetically by county within that year. You get, as I said, this is the index that website is indexing. And so here, you have the two people getting divorced. Often you get her married name, not always, or maiden name, not always. The date of the marriage, which I have found is often wrong by a year or two. And then the date of the divorce. At this point, there was no fault divorce. So you get cruel and abusive treatment, intoxication, desertion, and various other, those are the big ones that you'll see. And generally intoxication comes with one of the others. I've only rarely seen it as the only reason, but I have occasionally seen it as the only reason. And then with this information, that this is the Supreme Judicial Court of Aroostook County in 1902, we go to Family Search, look for records in the catalog that have Maine State Archives as the author, because most court records are now, that we will be looking for genealogy purposes, are in the state archives. Lincoln County's the exception. The Lincoln County Courthouse has a room that is archivally reasonable, so they still have their records. So we find the Supreme Judicial Court records for Aroostook County, and we go through, and you can see it's a lot of rolls of microfilm. We choose the one for the year we want. And at this point, this is the detail of the the original divorce case. This particular one, she's accusing him of horrendous abuse, and she gets the divorce. So it's worth doing this to get back to this, not just to that docket book listing, because it tells there wasn't any no-fault divorce, so sometimes I'm guessing these were exaggerated, but that's at least you get one side of the story. And then death records are kept also with the births and marriages. You get the same sort of information. I will say that often you get issues that aren't where the informant, and they don't tell you who the informant is on these. You get like parents' names and birthplaces are often a little off, just the way they are in most death records, because often it's grandson-in-law or distraught widow who's giving the information, and so it's worth, and particularly when you start getting into areas, now these two are from up north, there's a good chance that the clerk was also French speaking, but when you get further south, when you get a French speaking informant with an English speaking clerk, you can have some names pretty well mangled. So let's take a look at a project that is really helpful in many cases. The Maine Genealogical Society is trying to basically to track every household that's listed in the 1790 census, which had minimal information about the families. Head of the household and 5 categories of hash marks, and that was it. So the intention is, this is somewhat modeled after the Great Migration Project out of NEHGS in Boston for early New England settlers. And what you can do is, if you go to the Maine Genealogical Society's website, under shop, not research, but under shop, there is a master index for the 12 volumes of this that has been published. We also have an on paper version of this at the library. So you can look at this and see if people you're interested have been done. And what they're trying to do here, and this is actually one of the few women, she was a widow who was listed in 1790. And so here's the entry with those 5 tick mark columns, which we'll see again when we talk about the census. She's living in North Yarmouth in Cumberland County, gives all of the different names she's used at points, gives as much as the person could find about her and her children. This is the previous entry you'll see at the end. This Joseph Anderson is actually the one who's the editor for all of this, and he does a really good job of helping people get everything consistent in style. But if you're looking for people, my feeling is if you're looking for people from any earlier than the 1850 census, where you have the first every person named census, take a look, because if you've got somebody who was born in 1792, they may be here, or 1788, they may be here with their parents. And so that's worth looking to see. Here you have, these are people born in the 1720s who, obviously probably aren't going to be in the 1850 census. But if you've got them tracked back to, you may have someone like this Mary Ring, who's been, where you've got her back, and this information here about her mother is very helpful. So if you're researching before 1850 in Maine, it's worth checking these. The other thing to know is that unfortunately, volume 3 is very hard to get a hold of these days. There's a rights issue between the press that published it that's now gone out of business and the Maine Genealogical Society. But we have volume 3 at the library if you can't find it anywhere else. But as I said, this is worth checking because if somebody else has done this work, there's no sense reinventing the wheel on your family. And at this point, you're getting people who may have thousands of descendants alive. Okay, so let's look at the census. When you go to the search census page at Ancestry, this is what you get. Starting in 1790, federal census was done every 10 years. Some states did state censuses in between years. For example, Massachusetts has 1855 and 1865 surviving. Some Midwestern states have other years. New York has 1905, 1915, 1925. Unfortunately, Maine doesn't really have that. There was an 1837 partial census of the state done. It's Bangor and Portland and the unincorporated territories. So it's not that huge a percentage of the population, but it does exist. It's digitized at the Maine State Archives website. I'll come back to these at the bottom, but let's look at the regular population schedules first. So 1790, and one of the things to keep in mind is that up to 1820, because Maine was part of Massachusetts, there's a bit of ambiguity in where records might be. When it's something like the census that could be easily separated out, you can see here Maine is its own listing, even though it was part of Massachusetts, because it was easy geographically to separate out the returns for Maine. There's some other things like land records where if you get back before 1820 or before the American Revolution, you may well have, and before counties are broken out, you may well have records in Boston as well as in Maine. So keep that in mind when you get back to that before 1820. So this is the town of Rustfield Gore, which Ancestry in its infinite wisdom has indexed as Raffield Gore. It's now the town of Norway in Western Maine. And at the time of the 1790 census, there were 20 families with 102 people living in town. And as you can see, for each family, you get, this is the number of males over 16, number of males under 16, number of females. The empty columns in this case are free persons of color, and this column is slaves. This is very much the frontier at this point. None of these people had been here more than about 2 or 3 years. And interestingly, by 1800, there were 600 some people in town. So in 10 years, you get more than 6 times the population. Parts of Maine at this point had either really cheap land or they had military bounty land. So you do begin to get this influx of people for cheap land. So that's something to be aware of. Here in 1880, we have everybody listed, not just the head of the household. You get stated relationships. The couple censuses before this that had everybody. You don't, you just get the names without stated relationships. And these are the relationship to the head of the household. So if you have a wife, this daughter might be her daughter. It's the daughter of Asa. It could be Sophia's stepdaughter. So keep that in mind. Occupation, if someone's attending school, you get a little check mark here. Birthplace of the person on that line, and then their parents. So more information than earlier. And then by 1920, you get much more. You get information about the people. You get information about when they immigrated to the US and whether they were naturalized with an A or AL for alien, meaning they haven't started the process of being naturalized. And PA says they filed their paperwork, but they're not yet a citizen. You get information about reading and writing. And here you not only get birthplace, but native language. And so you will see things like these are people who were born in Finland, they speak Finnish. I've seen cases where you have somebody born in Finland speaks Swedish, born in Poland, but is a native speaker of German. And you also get the distinction when it says English here for Canada or French. It may be somebody who is French, maybe from New Brunswick and not Quebec. And so that's worth keeping in mind. There were places in Quebec that were settled by people from Scotland and Ireland. So you might get where it says English is their native language, but they actually are from Quebec. So that's something to keep in mind, that's the language, not the part of the country. And in addition to occupation here, you get the type of industry. So like it says teacher at a rural school, you'll see things like if it says carpenter, it may be say, he's a carpenter for a certain type of making furniture or whatever. So let's look at these down here at the bottom, because these are really interesting. And a lot of people either don't know they exist or don't use them as much as you could. And particularly for people who were showing up in these records from 1850 to 1880, there may be some information that takes you back further than that, 1850. I don't want to say it's a brick wall, but you often before 1850, you get a bit of an uphill climb on research in Maine. So here we have things like the mortality schedules and other non-population schedules that we're looking at agriculture and manufacturing. So one of the biggest ones here is that from 1850 to 1880, and again in 1885, and remember, this is before Maine is requiring vital records, you get these mortality schedules where the census asks who died in your town from, say, June 1st, 1879 to May 31st, 1880. And here you have the names, the demographic information, age, and so on, where they were born, where their parents were born, if they had an occupation, the month they died. You don't get the exact date, but you get the month, cause of death, and how long they had lived in that county. So as you can see, if you have someone who lived in a town that didn't have vital records before 1892, it is worth checking the mortality schedule to see if you can find them there. Does that make sense to everybody? I hope. This is the agricultural schedule. There was a similar one for industry, and it's the name of the farmer, how much land they have, what the current value is, how much is fenced, how much is grazing pasture, how much is cultivated, how much is forested, how much they paid people for labor in the previous year, how much grain they had grown, how many bushels of wheat or hay, how many pigs they owned, how many chickens they owned, and so on. So if you have an ancestor who was a farmer, in this regular census, it's worth seeing if they're listed in the agricultural census, because if they were working for somebody else as a farmer, they wouldn't be. But if they had their own farm, they will be. And you can see, here you have some people where their farms are worth 4 digits worth. So, here you have Jacob Cedarman has a $3,000 worth of land, whereas Charles Pikes has 500. So it gives you an idea, $500 worth of land. So it begins to give you an idea of, was your ancestor one of the more well-off people? Was he less well-off? Was he the only sheep grower and everybody else had cattle? To see how, what was happening in that area. Then there was the one that was done in 1880. And these next couple of things, let's just say our modern sensibilities were not the sensibilities of people in Victorian times. Okay. This is what's called the Schedule of Defective, Dependent, and Delinquent Classes. And what they are looking for is information on those people who were a pauper, insane, idiotic, blind, deaf, in prison, or homeless children. And so for each town, they go through. And so, for example, this one here, it's the list of everyone who's living at the poorhouse or where the town is paying them to board with somebody, a family. This is the people who were insane, and they are listed by the town they're from, even if, for example, this is for the town of Winthrop, which nowadays is a 15-minute drive down the road from Augusta. And so these people may well have been in the insane asylum here in Augusta. They'll be listed where they lived usually, and on this of where they were a patient. And this has been helpful sometimes with, finding it. I found several older ancestors at the time, or people I've worked with their ancestors, where they have what is probably dementia, or they have was probably glaucoma, macular degeneration, other reasons for not being able to see, age-related deafness, and so on. So it's handy for giving you that extra little bit of information about the family. Church records. These are not as well kept in Maine as in some other places, but there are some. So let's take a look. First off, most of the Catholic records for Maine before the 20th century, a lot of those were done as part of the Drouin collection that mostly did the records for Quebec. But the main ones are, as well as the ones from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, that area called Acadia, already ancestry for the Catholic records. The Boston area Catholic records are at American Ancestors, New England Historical and Genealogical Society. The Congregational Church, which is one of the two institutional descendants of the Pilgrims and Puritans, the other being the Unitarian Universalist Association, which there was a split in the 1820s between the Congregationalists and the Unitarians. Their library is trying to get a lot of their history online. Some of these records are a duplicate of things you'll find at places like Family Search, but the difference is these are modern scans, whereas in most cases, the ones at Family Search are digitized copies of things that were done in microfilm in the 1950s and 60s, 70s, where it's all black and white. These are color. And I've had a couple cases already where we've been able to read something in these new color scans that we couldn't read in the black and white digitized microfilm. So what they've been doing is they've been going through and finding whatever early records they can and digitizing them. They're working with various organizations to get things, so it's interesting. So let's take a look at Brunswick, Maine. They give you a little bit of the history of the church, given the years their records cover. And when you click through to these, you see, again, you have the history of the splits and the church buildings and all of that. This isn't all they have. This just happens to be their illustration. It's an 18th century list of the members of the church. So again, if your ancestor's there, it puts him or her at a particular time and place. They will have information about it, telling you how much, it's one box of records, not 17 boxes. They give you a sample citation, and then there's a longer historical note. This goes on for another couple pages. I didn't put it all in here, but just so you know, and I often am looking for the preferred citation because I figured they know their collection best and know what you need to have to find that piece of paper or that particular journal or whatever again. So here are a couple samples. You get, this was a sermon. This is someone declaring his faith to become a member. This is a case where somebody transfers his membership from one church to another. And so if you've got somebody, his name's a little unusual, but if you had somebody, say, who was a Robert Thompson, or John Putnam, for example, this may give you a clue as to where the person came from. So that's helpful. This is a list of baptisms. So you can see that there are a lot of things there. And I'm going to just briefly talk some about land records for tonight, and then we'll do questions, and then we'll pick up on the rest of this next week. So early land in Maine was either sold or granted from the state level. And those records are, a lot of them are here in Augusta, some are still in Boston. So these are notes on people surveying. These are the surveyor's notes, basically. Here's an early, as in, for Maine, 1795 is still a relatively early map of what's now the towns of Reedfield and Mount Vernon that was used with those surveyor notes to figure out where people could buy land. And these are all at the state archives. The scale on this is 200 rods to an inch. A rod is 16.5 feet. So, it's a pretty detailed map. Here you have, these are actually some islands, and this is an index saying, we surveyed it. Here's the Harbor Island. Their surveyor's notes are on pages, I think that's 45 and 46. There's 144 acres. Doesn't give a value. And a whole bunch of these were sold to the same person. Down here, you do get some where they've said it was 6 shillings an acre. So that's, this is the initial transfer of ownership from either Massachusetts Bay Colony, the state of Massachusetts, or the state of Maine to an individual owner. And let me just say before we go on, some of these early ones would be bounty land for military service. For example, the area that's now the town of Bethel in Western Maine was originally called Sudbury, Canada, because it was land that was given to men from Sudbury, Massachusetts, who had fought in the French and Indian Wars in Canada from that town. You can now today go to a deed site for the whole state and click through to that county's deed records. These are aimed at modern title searchers, so there tends to be a cost with those, which is, so it's really nice. We can go to Family Search, and you'll see here for Washington County, we have the deeds here online at Family Search for free. And many of them were recopied either in the late 19th, early 20th century. So they're legible, which is very helpful. And when they did that, they often put the names of the people involved here. There are some experimental search engine stuff being done. I'm not big on the technicalities of it, where Family Search and other such websites are trying to index everyone mentioned in a record, not just the buyer and seller, which will make life very interesting for finding, say, daughters with their maiden name where you don't know what their, or with their married name where you don't know what their maiden name is, and it may link a daughter or granddaughter to somebody. So I'm going to call it for tonight on that, and we will pick up with the rest of this next week. Let me stop sharing my screen. Any questions at this point? Okay.
I have a question. Oh, I'm
Sure.
sorry.
Beth, go ahead.
When you talked about church records, you said some are digitized, some are on microfilm, some are better to read than others. And I unfortunately was not writing fast enough as I listened. So if I look in Ancestry for the church records, are they the better or the worse in quality to look at?
They're so-so. If you're looking for congregational church records, which is often what you're looking for in Maine, it was the dominant church until you get Irish Catholics and French Catholics in around 1850. It's actually at the Congregational Library. If you Google Congregational Library, hidden histories will get you definitely to where you want to go.
Okay.
Because
and how about the Universalist Unitarian?
Those are spread out. Some of them are with the UUA in Boston, but relatively few. So it's somewhat of a treasure hunt. I know, for example, that for Belfast, Maine, they are actually at the Belfast Library.
Okay.
And have been indexed, but not digitized, at the Belfast Free Library website. But I would start with the Congregational Library and Archives. They're the ones who have the most. And if they don't have what you want, I would highly suggest sending them an email for two reasons. One is they may well know where it is, and that's worth doing for the Unitarian as well as the congregational records, because in many cases up through the 1820s, it's the same church.
Right.
And it's just when it splits in 1825. And the other is it lets them see who's interested in what. And if, 5 people call for, the town of Sanford, Maine, First Parish, they may move that more towards the top of seeing if they could get those done. I know I keep track of some of the requests we get as a way of trying to let people know what we should be digitizing. So that's what I would do, is I would check there first.
Okay.
If they don't know, and ask them. And if they don't know, that's where you start, Googling and seeing where things may be. Church records end up in places. It depends. Like the Free Will Baptist Archive, those of you who know Sam Howes, who used to be at the State Archives, he's now at Bates College, where they have the Free Will Baptist Archives. Some Northern New England my understanding, at least, I haven't worked with them, Northern New England Methodist records have ended up at, I want to say it's Wesleyan College in Connecticut, but it may be one of the other Wesleyans around.
Several years ago, I was working with Kathy McLaughlin. That's her name. It used to be in Damascotta, and she
Mhm.
talked about the Methodist archives, and I think she said they were in Boston. Does that sound right?
They could be, um, because it's not unusual for smaller denominations to work with a college or university,
Right.
like the Free Will Baptist. I mean, Bates was started by people in the Free Will Baptist movement, but that's what you get is, you know, in the Midwest, a lot of the Lutheran records are at various small Lutheran liberal arts college libraries. The big Quaker collections are at Guilford, Swarthmore, Haverford, and Wilmington and Earlham colleges, because those were all had Quaker influence or actual founding by Quaker groups. And so the denominations that are really top down, like the Catholic records, tend to stay in one place altogether. Whereas with these other groups that are very congregational in their polity and how they function and are governed, they can, you know, they may still be with the original church. I mean, there are
True.
cases in Scotland where, you know, the Free Church of Scotland records are still with the local church.
You just hope the church didn't burn.
Or, and actually, in a lot of these cases, it's not that it burned; it's that they didn't get stuff moldy.
Yeah.
I'm in a group that works with preserving things here in Maine, you know, artifacts and manuscripts and all of these things. And our basic philosophy here, when we're asked to give a presentation, is that here in Maine, all our problems pretty much for preserving things come back to water. Because even if it's a fire, the water often does more damage than the fire.
Yeah.
If it's put out, because they can catch the fire, but in catching the fire, the water so, and that's the concern. For example, that's one reason so many of the court records are at the state archives, is because it was not cost effective for each county hall across the state to have an archivally sound room, when the state archives could take these 100+ old records and use their space that is temperature and climate control, you know, temperature and humidity controlled. So that's something to be aware of, is sometimes things also move less for institutional policy and collections procedures, and more because they're putting them somewhere that the records will not end up moldy or otherwise damp. So that's one of the reasons I, you know, unless I know something somewhere, I'm like, yeah, it could be anywhere on a lot of these things. Because some of it depends on how committed the people in the organization are to saving things. And sometimes you get people in positions that, you know, local historical societies that are more interested in the pride of saying they have something than in keeping it in the right conditions. So that's just something to be aware of.
Thank you.
Someone else had a question.
I have a question for you. This is excellent. And you know, I do a lot of Maine research. You pulled it together in such a wonderfully straightforward way. And
this is just the first half. Next week we'll do the second half.
First half is awesome. So the one thing I noticed was I was enjoying listening so much that I wasn't writing down the sources. So the slides didn't have, not all of them did, some did, the actual location that you were looking at, whether it was Family Search or whether it was something else. would you be able to put together a listing that you could also post on the YouTube, like a page of bibliography or
Yeah, I
link?
actually have. I did.
You've
You
done it?
came in. You didn't hear the backstory on this. I did this
No.
program last night for a genealogy society in New Brunswick, and decided after I did it that there were few things they didn't record it. I didn't think to record it because I was all nervous. And so I figured I'd do it again for you guys so that I'd have the recording to put up on YouTube. And so I actually already have the a handout. And so
Right.
I will get it put up and send you guys the link.
No, that's
so
excellent.
that
You
you
know,
Thank
can.
you.
yeah,
This
it
was
makes
super.
such a difference to be able to know how easy you have located some of these things rather
Yeah.
than trying to go through the indexes. So thanks a lot.
Yeah.
This really is a great thing to have as a resource up there.
My hope, one of the things I decided I was going to try to do this year was do a better job, even if it's only a list of links with not much commentary, is have something for you most weeks. And I have not started out that well, but I'm trying. And remind me, say you promised us that you would give us links. So I will do my best to get stuff out, because I kind of like the idea that you don't have to write everything down, that I can hand you. I've gone to these websites to clip pictures, so I might as well throw the links in Word and let you guys just listen and learn without having to worry about scribbling things down.
That's great.
So that was one of my, I don't want to say it was a New Year's resolution, because it was actually later in the year. It was the end of January or so. I was thinking I really should get back to doing handouts. So,
Well, thank you much. Really appreciate it.
Good program tonight.
thank you. And
Where are
any
your
other
cats?
questions?
Where are the cats?
They're here. In fact,